The first thing I tasted when I opened my eyes was blood. My own blood, thick and copper-sweet against my tongue, pooling from a gash somewhere above my left ear. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Not the gentle quiet of a ship at rest, but the hollow, dead silence of systems that had stopped working. No hum from the reactor. No whisper from the air recyclers. Nothing but the distant groan of metal bending under stress it was never designed to hold. I pushed myself up from the floor of the medical bay and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through my ribs, sharp enough to steal my breath. 2 broken, maybe 3. I braced myself against an overturned surgical table and forced my lungs to work. Breathe in, breathe out. Stay conscious. My name is Kethra. I am a medical officer of the Velani Concorde, and until roughly 6 hours ago, I served aboard the survey vessel Ilsar's Promise, a ship that was supposed to chart mineral deposits in the Goran Expanse. A ship with 83 crew members, 4 armed escort vessels, and a mission clearance signed by the Concorde Assembly itself. None of that mattered now. The Dreth hit us at the edge of the expanse, right where our long-range sensors thinned out and left blind spots wide enough to fly a warship through. 3 raider cruisers dropped out of slip space in a triangular formation, already firing before their engines finished cooling. They wanted our crew. Velani fetch a strong price on the slaver markets of the outer systems. Healthy ones bring even more. Our escorts ran. I need you to understand that. 4 armed warships, built for exactly this kind of engagement, turned their drives to full and jumped away within 90 seconds of the first shots. They did not fire back. They did not deploy countermeasures. They did not even warn us. They simply calculated that 4 military vessels were worth more than 1 survey ship and its crew, and they left. The Dreth raked us with pulse cannons for another 20 minutes after that. I do not know why they stopped. Perhaps they thought we were dead. Perhaps another target drew their attention. All I know is that when the firing ended, the Ilsar's Promise was a broken thing drifting in dead space with no engines, no communications, no shields, and a reactor that was bleeding radiation through a cracked housing into the lower decks. I got the medical bay door open by prying it with a metal strut. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by the faint amber glow of emergency strips that were already starting to flicker. I called out. My voice sounded small, fragile, like something the silence could swallow without effort. Someone answered, a young voice, tight with pain but alive. I found Sorik 3 compartments forward, pinned beneath a collapsed ceiling panel. He was an engineer, barely out of his training cycle, with wide gray eyes and hands that would not stop shaking. It took me 10 minutes to free him. He had a broken arm and deep lacerations across his back, but he could walk, and more importantly, he could think. That mattered more than anything else in those first hours. Together, we moved through the upper decks, searching. The corridors were a nightmare of tangled wiring and buckled panels, emergency lighting casting everything in that sickly amber glow that made every shadow look like a body. We called out at every junction, banged on sealed doors, pressed our ears against bulkheads and listened for movement on the other side. We found survivors in clusters of 2 and 3, huddled in sealed compartments or wedged into crawl spaces where the structure had partially collapsed around them. Some were conscious and responded to our voices with weak calls of relief. Some were not, lying still and silent, and I had to check each one for a pulse before I could determine whether they were alive or simply not alive anymore. I treated what I could with what I had, which was almost nothing. My portable medkit held enough supplies for minor field injuries, a handful of wound sealants, basic pain medication, a few doses of cellular repair compound. What I was looking at was not minor. I was looking at plasma burns and crush injuries and penetrating trauma that needed surgery, not a field kit. At one point we reached a sealed door that we could hear voices behind. 3 crew members, trapped when the corridor ceiling had collapsed on both sides of their compartment. We could talk to them. We could hear them breathing, but the debris was too heavy for Sorik and me to clear, and every attempt sent tremors through the surrounding structure that threatened to bring more of it down on top of us. I told them to stay calm, that we would come back with tools. I told them we would get them out. I was not certain I was telling the truth, but they needed to hear it. We did get them out, 4 hours later, using a hydraulic jack that Sorik salvaged from a maintenance locker. By then, one of the three had lost consciousness from internal bleeding, and she never woke up again. By the time we finished our sweep of the accessible decks, we had counted 19 survivors out of 83. 19 people alive in a ship designed for almost 100. The rest were gone, either killed in the attack or trapped in compartments below the radiation line, where the cracked reactor was slowly poisoning everything it touched. I could hear them down there, some of them, faint sounds that carried through the deck plating, voices, movement. Someone tapping a rhythmic pattern against a pipe, the universal signal for help. I could not reach them. The radiation levels in the lower decks were lethal within minutes. Going down there would mean dying alongside them instead of saving anyone above. I gathered everyone in the forward observation lounge, the largest intact space on the upper decks. It had viewports that looked out into the Goran expanse, and through them I could see nothing. No stars bright enough to navigate by. No nebulae. No stations or relay beacons blinking their steady signals of civilization. Just darkness in every direction, stretching out forever. The Goran expanse is what spacefaring species call a dead zone. It sits between two galactic arms like a vast empty canyon, hundreds of light years across, with nothing in it worth claiming. No habitable worlds, no resource-rich asteroid fields, no strategic positions. Ships cross it only when they must, and they cross it fast, because if something goes wrong out here, there is no one to hear you, and no one coming to help. I took stock of our situation, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The reactor was failing. We could not shut it down without losing all remaining power, but every hour it ran, it pushed more radiation into the lower decks. Eventually, that radiation would creep upward into our sealed section. The air recyclers were operating on backup reserves, which meant we had a finite amount of breathable atmosphere. I checked the readouts on the emergency panel 3 times, because I did not want to believe the number. 47 hours. That was how long our air would last at current consumption rates with 19 people breathing. Food was not the problem. Water was not the problem. We would suffocate long before we starved. The communications array was destroyed. Not damaged, not offline, but physically gone. The Dreth had targeted it specifically because slavers do not want their prey calling for help. All that remained was a small emergency transmitter, buried deep in the ship's spine, designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophic damage. It had a range of perhaps 2 light hours under ideal conditions. Out here, with no relay stations to boost the signal, it might as well have been a candle in a hurricane. I told the survivors the truth. I did not soften it, because they deserved to know what we were facing. Some of them cried, some went quiet, a few argued, insisting that the escorts would send help, that the Concorde would come looking for us, that someone would notice we were missing and do something about it. I let them talk. I did not tell them what I already knew, which was that the escorts would report us destroyed. It was the logical thing to do. Filing a distress report would require them to explain why they fled without engaging the enemy, which would trigger a formal inquiry, which would end careers. It was simpler and cleaner to mark the Ilsar's promise as lost with all hands and move on. The Concorde bureaucracy would process the paperwork, send condolence notices to our families, and close the file. We were already dead in every way that mattered to the people who could save us. Sorik came to me, near the end of that first terrible day, with an idea that was more desperation than engineering. He could not repair the comms array, but he thought he could rig the emergency transmitter to send a repeating pulse. Not a voice signal, not a data burst. Just a rhythmic electromagnetic heartbeat, broadcasting on a wide band, repeating endlessly until the power ran out. I asked him what good it would do. He looked at me with those wide gray eyes and said he did not know. But it was something. It was a sound in the silence. And if anyone, anywhere, happened to be listening on the right frequency at the right time, they might hear it and wonder what it was. I told him to do it. He worked for 3 hours with his broken arm splinted against his chest, crawling through maintenance shafts with a toolkit held in his teeth. When he finally got the pulse running, we gathered around the engineering terminal and watched the signal trace on the display. A single blip, repeating every 4 seconds. It was weak. It was crude. It looked like nothing against the vast emptiness of the expanse. But it was ours. It was proof that we were still here, still breathing, still refusing to be nothing. Night came, or what passed for night on a ship with no functioning day cycle. I dimmed the emergency lights and told everyone to sleep. Most of them could not. I heard whispered conversations in the dark, people talking about families and homes, and things they wished they had said before this mission. I heard someone praying to old gods that I had thought no one believed in anymore. I did not sleep either. I sat beside a crewmate named Delis, a young cartographer who had taken a piece of shrapnel through her abdomen during the attack. I had done what I could for her, but what I could do was not enough. She was bleeding internally, and without a proper surgical suite, I could not stop it. All I could do was manage her pain and sit with her. She died 3 hours before what would have been morning. She was 24 years old. She had joined the survey mission because she wanted to see parts of the galaxy that no one had mapped before. She held my hand at the end and asked me if the stars outside the viewport were the ones she had been looking for. I told her yes. I think she believed me. I closed her eyes and updated my count. 18 survivors, 41 hours of air. The pulse kept beating in the dark. That small, stubborn signal pushing out into nothing, reaching for ears that were not there. I stood at the viewport and pressed my forehead against the cold glass and stared into the Goran expanse, and I felt the silence stare back. 41 hours. The number sat in my mind like a stone. Somewhere behind me, the pulse repeated. A heartbeat. Our heartbeat. And no one was listening. I had always believed that despair arrived suddenly, like a blade drawn across the throat. I was wrong. Despair is slow. It seeps in through the cracks like cold water, filling you degree by degree until you realize you have been drowning for hours and did not notice. 3 days after the attack, I stood in the forward observation lounge and counted heads again. 15. We had lost 3 more. 2 died from wounds that I could not treat with the supplies I had, injuries that any proper medical facility could have handled in an afternoon. The third was a reactor technician named Hall, who volunteered to enter the contaminated lower decks to retrieve water canisters from the cargo hold. He was exposed to a concentrated radiation burst when a secondary seal failed. He made it back with the water. He died 8 hours later, his cells breaking apart faster than his body could repair them. I cleaned his body and wrapped him in a thermal sheet, and placed him with the others in a sealed compartment that we had turned into a makeshift morgue. 8 bodies now. 8 colleagues who had been alive and working and planning their futures less than a week ago. The air was getting thin. Not dangerously thin, not yet, but I could feel it in the way my thoughts moved slower than they should, the way a deep breath never quite felt deep enough. The recyclers were running on fumes, pulling every last molecule of oxygen from the diminishing reserves and pushing it back into our sealed section, with a wheeze that sounded increasingly tired. Sorek had recalculated our timeline after each death. Fewer breathers meant less consumption, which meant more time. It was a horrible arithmetic, trading lives for hours, but it was the only math that mattered now. His latest estimate gave us 53 hours. 3 deaths had bought us almost 2 additional days. I hated that I found comfort in that number. The fractures among the survivors started on the 2nd day and widened on the 3rd. It was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches or physical confrontations. It was quieter than that, more corrosive. It lived in the looks people exchanged when they thought I was not watching, in the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Braylith was the center of it. He was our senior navigator, a tall and sharp-featured Vailani with 40 years of service to the Concord and the kind of calm, measured authority that people naturally gravitate toward in a crisis. He did not challenge me openly. He did not need to. He simply asked questions, reasonable questions, in a tone that suggested the answers were obvious to everyone except me. Why were we still running the distress pulse? It consumed power. Power meant heat, light, air recycling. Every watt we spent broadcasting into empty space was a watt we could not spend keeping ourselves alive. He was not wrong. That was the worst part. His logic was clean and precise and completely defensible. Shutting down the pulse would redirect power to the recyclers and buy us perhaps 6 more hours of breathable air. 6 hours was not nothing. 6 hours was the difference between dying on a Wednesday and dying on a Thursday, which sounds meaningless until you are the one counting the minutes. I brought it to Sorek because he had built the pulse. and he understood the power systems better than anyone else on board. He listened to Braleth's argument with his broken arm, cradled against his chest, and his gray eyes fixed on the floor. When he looked up, his expression was the saddest thing I had seen since this nightmare began. 6 hours would not save us, he said. Nothing would save us unless someone heard the pulse, and no one would hear the pulse if we turned it off. I sided with Sorek, and told Braleth the pulse would continue. He accepted my decision with a small nod that somehow conveyed more contempt than a raised voice ever could. He went back to his group of 4 loyal crew members and said nothing more about it. But from that point forward, there were 2 camps in the observation lounge, and the distance between them grew with every passing hour. The division showed itself in small ways. Braleth's group took their water rations separately. They slept in a cluster near the far viewport, facing away from the rest of us. They stopped participating in the small communal rituals that had developed, the sharing of stories before sleep, the quiet words spoken over those we lost. It was not hostility, it was withdrawal. They were already grieving us, already separating themselves from the dead who had not yet stopped breathing. I could not entirely blame them. Braleth was a navigator, a man whose entire career was built on calculating trajectories and probabilities. He looked at our situation and saw what the numbers said, and the numbers said we were finished. His retreat was not cruelty, it was self-preservation. The same instinct that had driven our escorts to flee, just expressed in a smaller and quieter way. On the 3rd night, I sat alone in the medical bay and faced the thing I had been refusing to look at directly. I had enough sedative left in my kit to put every survivor into a painless sleep from which they would not wake up. Not enough for surgical anesthesia, but more than enough for a permanent and gentle end. We would simply drift off, one by one, and the pain and the fear and the slow suffocation would stop. I held the vials in my hands and felt their weight, and thought about what it would mean to use them. It would be merciful. It would be a kindness. It would be the rational choice. The same kind of cold and perfect logic that had driven our escorts to abandon us. I lined them up on the counter and counted them. 15 vials for 15 people. 1 each, measured and precise. The dosage calculated in my head before I could stop myself from doing the math. I imagined going to each survivor, one by one, offering them a choice. Some would take it, some would refuse. And what would I do with the ones who refused? Force mercy on them? Let them suffocate slowly while the others slipped away peacefully? The questions multiplied until they filled the room, until they pressed against the walls, until I felt them crushing me the way the Goran expanse was crushing our little ship. I put the vials back in the kit and sealed it shut. I was not ready to be rational. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning of the 4th day began with a sound that made my heart stop. Sorek came running into the observation lounge so fast that he tripped over a sleeping crewmate and nearly crashed into the far wall. His face was flushed a deep violet, which in Vaylani physiology means either extreme exertion or extreme emotion. In his case, it was both. He had been monitoring the emergency transmitter out of habit, watching our pulse go out and listening to the static that came back. He did this for hours at a stretch, sitting in the engineering alcove with his ear pressed to the speaker, as if devotion alone could summon a reply. This time, something had answered. Not a reply to our signal, not a directed communication, but a broad-spectrum transmission, cutting through the background noise of the expanse, on a frequency band that no Concord species used. It was powerful, far more powerful than anything our crippled systems could produce, and it was crude in a way that made no technical sense. Instead of a tight, efficient beam, it was a wideband broadcast that splashed energy across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, like someone had thrown a bucket of water at a wall. I ran to the engineering alcove and listened. The signal was unmistakable, a structured pattern buried in the noise, repeating at regular intervals. It was not random. It was not natural. Someone or something was broadcasting out here in the dead zone, where nothing existed and no one traveled. My first reaction was not hope. It was terror. The Dreth could have returned. They sometimes circled back to pick over the wreckage of ships they had attacked, scavenging technology, and checking for survivors they might have missed. If the raiders had detected our pulse and come back to finish the job, then I had killed us all by keeping the transmitter running. Bralith's cold logic would have been right, and my stubbornness would have been the thing that ended us. I told Sorek to try to analyze the signal, to match it against any known pattern in our remaining database fragments. He worked quickly, his one good hand flying across a cracked display, while the broken one hung useless at his side. Minutes passed. The signal grew stronger. Whatever was producing it was moving toward us. Sorek looked up from the display, and his expression was something I had never seen before. Not fear, not hope, but a kind of bewildered disbelief, as if he had solved an equation and gotten an answer that should not exist. The signal did not match any Concord species. It did not match the Dreth. It did not match anything in our database. The energy signature attached to it was massive, suggesting a vessel of considerable size, and it was closing on our position at a speed that made no sense for normal space travel. Whatever this was, it was pushing through the expanse like the expanse was not even there. I walked back to the observation lounge and looked at the 15 faces waiting for me. They had heard Sorek's footsteps. They had seen my face. They knew something had changed, and they were balanced on the edge between hope and panic, waiting for me to tell them which way to fall. I told them the truth, because that was all I had left to give. An unknown vessel was approaching our position. We did not know who it was. We did not know what it wanted. It could be rescue, or it could be something worse. And we had no weapons, no shields, and no way to run. Bralith stood up and said what everyone was thinking. If it was the Dreth, we should use the remaining power to seal the compartments and hide. Make the ship look dead, look empty, and pray they passed us by. Sorek shook his head. The signal was too strong. Whatever was out there, it already knew exactly where we were. Our pulse had led it straight to us. The room went silent. 15 people held their breath and stared at the viewport, as if they could see through the darkness to whatever was coming. I stood at the glass and watched the emptiness, and felt the seconds stretch into something vast and terrible. The sensor display behind me flickered with static, and through the static, a shape began to form. A silhouette on the edge of detection range, angular and hard-edged, growing larger with every sweep of our failing sensors. Sorek's voice reached me from across the room, and I heard it break on the last word. "It is not Dreth," he said. "The energy signature does not match anything I have ever seen. I do not know what this is." The shape on the sensors grew. It was enormous. It was fast. And it was broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, filling the silence of the Goran expanse with a sound that should not have been there. Something was coming for us through the dark, and I had no idea whether to pray for its arrival or its passing. The ship that emerged from the darkness was not beautiful. I want to be clear about that, because so much of what came after might tempt you to romanticize the moment, to paint it with the golden light of salvation and make it into something soft. It was not soft. It was not graceful. It was the most brutal, purposeful thing I had ever seen hanging in the void of space. It came out of what the humans later told me they call a hard burn, which is their way of describing a sustained maximum thrust approach that trades fuel efficiency for raw speed. The ship decelerated in a way that should have turned anything inside it into paste against the forward bulkheads. Later, I learned that humans use compensating gravity systems during these maneuvers, systems that they designed because their species apparently considers traveling at velocities that would kill most other beings to be an acceptable method of getting somewhere in a hurry. The vessel was roughly twice the size of the Ilsar's Promise. It was flat and angular, like someone had taken a rectangular block of metal and reinforced every surface until it could survive a collision with a small moon. No curves, no aesthetic considerations, no concession to the idea that a ship should look like anything other than what it was. And what it was, I understood immediately, was a tool, a machine built for a single purpose, and built so well that nothing in the galaxy was going to stop it from fulfilling that purpose. Sensor arrays bristled from every surface, like the spines of a deep ocean creature. Docking clamps lined the ventral hull in rows, heavy-duty mechanisms designed to grab onto another vessel and hold it steady regardless of spin or drift. The hull was scarred and pitted with the marks of a ship that had spent years in hard space, a ship that had been used, and used hard, and maintained just well enough to keep flying. I stood at the viewport and watched it approach, and my body could not decide whether to collapse with relief or lock up with terror. Beside me, Braleth had gone absolutely still, his eyes fixed on the closing vessel with an expression of calculation. Behind us, the other survivors pressed against the glass or huddled in corners, depending on whether their instinct was to face the unknown or hide from it. Then the signal changed. The broad-spectrum broadcast that had been filling our sensors shifted to a directed transmission aimed squarely at our ship, and from the static and noise of a battered emergency receiver, a voice emerged. It was strange, deeper than a Vaylani voice, with hard consonants and a rhythm that rolled unevenly, like water tumbling over rocks. It spoke in Galactic Trade Common, which every spacefaring species learns as a baseline for communication, but it spoke it with an accent I had never heard before, rounding vowels that should be sharp and biting down on syllables that most species let flow. Unidentified vessel. This is the Terran Union search and rescue cutter Santiago Ridge, operating under Universal Distress Protocols. We received your emergency pulse and have adjusted course to render assistance. Please respond with your species, number of survivors, and current medical status. The voice repeated the message twice more. Calm, clear, and patient. Not threatening, not demanding, simply asking for information so it could help. I looked at Sorik. He looked at me. Neither of us had ever heard of the Terran Union. Neither of us recognized the species designation attached to the vessel. Braleth spoke first. He said we should not respond. We did not know these creatures, did not know their intentions, and could not verify their claim. For all we knew, this was a pirate vessel using a false identity to lure damaged ships into lowering their defenses. He was not wrong, but I looked around that room at the 15 faces staring back at me, some of them gray with pain, some of them shaking with fear, all of them breathing air that was getting thinner by the hour, and I made a decision. We were going to die in this room if nothing changed. That was a certainty. Responding to the unknown vessel was a risk, but the certainty of death outweighed the risk of strangers. And I was not going to let my crew suffocate in the dark because I was afraid of something I did not understand. I went to the emergency transmitter and keyed the response channel. My hands were shaking so badly that Sorik had to hold the microphone steady while I spoke. Santiago Ridge, this is Medical Officer Kethra of the Vaylani Concord survey vessel Ilsar's Promise. We have 15 survivors, multiple critical injuries. Our reactor is compromised and leaking radiation. Life support is failing. We have approximately 40 hours of breathable air remaining. I paused, and then added something that was not part of any protocol. I said, please. The response came back within seconds, and what struck me was not the words themselves, but the shift in tone. The first broadcast had been measured and professional, a standardized hail following established procedures. This reply was different. It was urgent. Someone on that ship had heard our numbers and our situation, and had immediately understood exactly how bad things were. Ilsar's Promise. We copy your status. We are adjusting approach for emergency dock. Do not attempt to move your vessel. We will compensate for your current drift and spin. Medical team is staging now. We need to know if your atmosphere is nitrogen-oxygen compatible, and what your ambient temperature and pressure tolerances are. They were asking about our biology. They were already planning treatment before they had even reached us. They wanted to know what we breathed and what temperatures we could survive, so they could prepare their medical supplies in advance. Sorik transmitted our environmental specifications while I organized the survivors. Whatever was about to happen, I wanted everyone in one place and as ready as they could be. Those who could walk helped those who could not. We cleared the center of the observation lounge and laid the critically wounded on makeshift bedding. Through the viewport, I watched the Santiago Ridge close the distance. It moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, adjusting its trajectory in smooth, precise corrections that spoke of a crew that had done this many times before. Our ship was tumbling slowly on 2 axes, a gentle but relentless spin that would make docking nearly impossible for any vessel I had ever served on. The human ship did not seem to care. I saw thrusters fire along its flanks in coordinated microbursts, dozens of them firing in sequence, and the Santiago Ridge matched our spin with a delicacy that contradicted everything about its brutal appearance. It came alongside us like a predator matching pace with wounded prey, except this predator had no intention of feeding. It was gentle, impossibly, absurdly gentle for a ship that looked like it had been designed to punch through asteroid fields. Then came the sound of contact, a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the hull of the Ilsar's Promise and made every surface hum. The docking clamps had engaged. We were locked together with something we did not understand, something from a species none of us had met, and there was no going back. The next minutes were the longest of my life. We heard sounds through the hull, metallic and purposeful, the noise of tools and machinery working on the other side of our walls. Then a hissing sound, steady and controlled, growing louder, until it resolved into the unmistakable rush of pressurization. They were building an atmosphere bridge, not connecting to our airlock, because our airlocks had been destroyed in the attack, but cutting directly through our hull and sealing the breach behind some kind of inflatable corridor that maintained pressure on both sides. It was engineering that I did not have a framework for. You do not cut through the hull of a ship you are trying to rescue. You do not breach a pressurized vessel while people are inside it. The risk of explosive decompression alone should have made it unthinkable. But these humans, whoever they were, had apparently decided that the rules of what was thinkable did not apply to them. A section of the forward bulkhead glowed orange, then white, then fell inward in a perfectly cut circle. Beyond it, I could see the interior of a pressure corridor, a flexible tube of heavy material, lit by harsh white lights. And standing in that corridor, framed by the light behind her, was the first human I had ever seen. She was short by Vaylani standards, broad across the shoulders and thick through the limbs, in a way that suggested density rather than softness. She wore a heavy suit, covered in pockets and attachment points, and her face was wide and flat, with small eyes set deep beneath a prominent brow ridge. Her skin was a warm brown, and her dark hair was cut close to her skull. She stepped through the breach into our ship, looked around the room full of frightened aliens, and pulled off her helmet. Then she spoke, and her voice was firm and steady, and carried the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Okay, who is hurt worst? Take me to them first." No introduction, no diplomatic preamble, no discussion of treaties or jurisdictions, or the political implications of an unknown species boarding a Concorde vessel. She looked at a room full of dying people, and her only thought was to find the one dying fastest. Her name was Lucy Farrow, and she was the rescue team leader. Behind her, 4 more humans came through the breach in quick succession, each carrying equipment cases and wearing the same heavy suits. They moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out through the lounge, kneeling beside the wounded, pulling out devices I did not recognize. I led Lucy to our worst cases. A crewmate named Pereth, who had third-degree plasma burns across 60% of his body. A young communications officer, whose legs had been crushed by falling debris and who had been drifting in and out of consciousness for 2 days. An older engineer, who was showing the first signs of radiation poisoning from his shift near the compromised reactor. Lucy examined each of them with a speed and focus that left me breathless. She carried a device on her wrist that projected data onto a small transparent screen, and she input our biological information as she worked. She asked me questions, rapid and precise, about Vaylani physiology, organ placement, blood chemistry, pain thresholds, allergic reactions. She listened to every answer and filed it away instantly, adjusting her approach in real time. Then the medic arrived. His name was Daniel Holt, and he was carrying a portable field kit the size of a travel case that opened into what I can only describe as a miniature laboratory. He set it up on the floor of the observation lounge, knelt beside it, and began working. I watched him synthesize a Vaylani-compatible plasma substitute from base chemical components in under 20 minutes. I need you to understand what that means. He took raw molecular building blocks and assembled them into a biological compound compatible with a species he had never treated before. Working from the physiological data I had provided and cross-referencing it against a database in his kit's onboard computer. Our best medical researchers take weeks to develop cross-species treatments in fully equipped laboratories. This human did it on the floor of a damaged ship with a portable kit and the calm demeanor of someone performing a task he had done 100 times before. He looked up at me while the compound was synthesizing, and must have seen the expression on my face, because he smiled in a way that I now know humans use to convey reassurance. It is an odd gesture, the baring of teeth, and on a Vaylani it would signal aggression, but there was nothing aggressive about Daniel Holt. His eyes were kind and tired, the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal of suffering and had chosen to spend his life fighting against it. While Daniel worked on the medical emergencies, the rest of the rescue team began assessing our ship. They moved through the corridors with handheld scanners, mapping the radiation zones, checking structural integrity, and planning evacuation routes. They reported back to their ship in short, clipped transmissions that I could overhear through their open communication channel. I noticed something about the way the humans communicated. There was no wasted language, no hesitation, no uncertainty, no asking for permission. Each team member reported what they found, received acknowledgement, and moved on. They operated like the components of a single organism, each part knowing its function and trusting the other parts to know theirs. I had served on Concorde vessels my entire career, and I had never seen a crew function with that level of seamless coordination. One of the rescue team, a compact man with deep-set eyes and scarred hands, stopped beside me in the corridor and asked if there were any compartments I had not been able to access. I told him about the lower decks, the radiation levels, the sounds I had heard through the deck plating on the first day. He listened, nodded, and made a note on his scanner without changing expression. Then he asked how long ago I had heard the sounds. I told him 4 days. He nodded again and moved on, and the gentleness with which he chose not to say what we both knew cut deeper than any words could have. The picture they described was worse than I had thought. The Ilsar's promise was not just damaged, it was dying. The reactor housing was deteriorating faster than Sorik had estimated, and the radiation was creeping upward through the deck seams at a rate that would reach our sealed section within 18 hours. The structural supports in the midsection were buckling under the stress of the ship's tumbling motion. Sooner or later, probably sooner, the Ilsar's promise was going to break apart. We needed to evacuate, all 15 of us, through a single hull breach, off a ship that was spinning and cracking and flooding with radiation. And the humans simply nodded and started planning how to do it. I stood in the middle of that organized chaos and watched a species I had never heard of take control of a situation that my own government had already written off as a total loss. They did not ask for permission. They did not wait for authorization. They heard a signal in the dark and they came, and now they were here, and they were going to get us out. A young human passed me carrying a length of heavy cable over one shoulder. He was tall and lean, with light brown hair and a face full of freckles, and he moved with the easy energy of someone who had not been slowly suffocating for 4 days. His name tag read, "O. Price." He caught me staring and gave me the same teeth-baring gesture that Daniel had offered. "We have got you," he said. "Just stay close and do what Lucy says. We have done this before." I wanted to ask how many times. I wanted to ask what kind of species builds ships and trains crews for the sole purpose of pulling strangers out of the dark. I wanted to ask 100 questions that were crowding my mind, like passengers fighting for space on a lifeboat. But there was no time. Lucy was calling for me, and behind her, Daniel was preparing the first of our wounded for transfer through the breach, and the ship groaned around us like an animal in pain. The rescue had begun. The evacuation of the Ilsar's promise took 11 hours. I know this because one of the humans had a timer running on his wrist display, tracking the operation from the moment the first survivor crossed through the breach to the moment the last one was secured aboard the Santiago Ridge. 11 hours of controlled urgency, of methodical precision, executed inside a ship that was trying its best to collapse on top of us. The critically wounded went first. Daniel Holt had stabilized 3 of our worst cases with the plasma substitute he had synthesized, and a combination of pain management techniques that I had never encountered. He used localized neural dampening, targeted not at the brain but at specific nerve clusters, to block pain signals without suppressing consciousness. When I asked him how he knew where Availani's nerve clusters were located, he showed me a database on his field kit's display. It contained physiological profiles of over 200 galactic species, cross-referenced with emergency treatment protocols for each. 200 species. They had prepared for the possibility of rescuing any of them. The transfer process itself was terrifying and remarkable in equal measure. The humans had anchored their pressure corridor to both ships with magnetic clamps and reinforcing struts, creating a flexible but stable passage between the breach in our hull and an access port on the Santiago Ridge. Each wounded crewmate was secured to a lightweight stretcher, carried through the corridor by 2 humans, and received on the other side by additional medical staff. It sounds simple. It was not. The ILSAR's promise was still spinning on 2 axes. The Santiago Ridge was compensating with constant thruster adjustments, but perfect compensation is impossible, and every few minutes there would be a shift, a lurch, a moment where the pressure corridor flexed, and the footing became treacherous. The humans moved through these shifts without breaking stride. They had trained for unstable environments. They expected the ground to move beneath them, and they moved with it. Lucy Farrow coordinated the operation from inside our ship, stationing herself at the breach point and directing traffic with hand signals and short radio calls. I worked beside her, guiding the stretcher teams to each wounded crewmate, providing medical updates, and trying to keep the ambulatory survivors calm and ready for their turn. Bralith and his group went early. I expected him to resist, to insist on some kind of protocol or verification, or formal agreement, before allowing himself to be transferred to an alien vessel. Instead, he looked at the humans working around him, assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a career navigator, and walked through the breach without a word. Whatever his reservations about our rescuers, his survival instincts were stronger. By the 5th hour, 9 of our 15 survivors had been transferred. The 6 remaining were the ones who could walk and who had volunteered to go last. Sorek was among them. So was I. And that was when the ship tried to kill us. The sound came first, a deep, structural groan that rose in pitch until it became a shriek of metal failing under stress. I felt the deck tilt beneath my feet, a sudden and sickening shift that sent equipment sliding and people stumbling. Lucy grabbed a wall strut and braced herself, her eyes going to the ceiling as if she could see through it to the source of the sound. Her radio crackled. A voice from the Santiago Ridge, tight with urgency, reported that the midsection supports of the ILSAR's promise had partially collapsed. The ship was bending, folding slowly at the waist like a creature trying to curl around a wound. The structural failure was cascading, each broken support transferring its load to the next and the next, in a chain that would eventually reach the forward section where we were standing. We had maybe 40 minutes before the forward section either separated from the rest of the ship or compressed inward on itself. Lucy did not panic. I watched her face in that moment and saw something that I have thought about many times since. She did not panic, but she also did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. She processed the information, accepted it, and immediately began working within the new constraints. She called 2 of her team back from the Santiago Ridge and began an accelerated evacuation of the remaining survivors. The careful, measured process of the first 9 hours became a controlled sprint. Sorek was lifted bodily by a human twice his weight and carried through the corridor at a pace that left me breathless just watching. 4 survivors left, then 3. Then the beam fell. It came from the ceiling of the corridor connecting the observation lounge to the rest of the forward section, a structural crossbeam that had held for 4 days and chose this moment to let go. It came down in a shower of sparks and twisted metal and dust, and it fell directly across the path between the lounge and the breach. 2 of my crew were on the wrong side of it, a communications technician named Varath, and a young life sciences researcher named Paulus, both pinned in the corridor by debris, and under the beam itself, half buried in wreckage, was Owen Price. The young human with the freckles and the easy smile, who had told me they had done this before. I heard Lucy's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She was already moving, already calling for cutting tools, already assessing the debris field, and planning how to get through it. 2 more humans came back through the corridor from the Santiago Ridge, carrying plasma torches and hydraulic spreaders. The radiation alarm went off while they worked. The secondary seal on the reactor housing had failed, and a concentrated wave of contamination was flooding upward through the ventilation shafts into the forward section. Not the slow creep we had been monitoring for days, but a sudden surge, a dam breaking. The humans' dosimeters began chirping, then beeping, then screaming. They did not stop working. I stood on my side of the debris, and watched through the gaps as two humans cut through twisted metal in an environment that was actively poisoning them. Their dosimeters wailed. Warning lights on their suits flashed amber, then red. They kept cutting. They kept lifting. They kept working. Owen Price was conscious under the wreckage. I could hear his voice, strained and tight with pain, but remarkably steady. He was not screaming. He was not pleading. He was talking to Vareth and Paulus in that oddly accented trade common, keeping them calm, telling them stories about places he had been and things he had seen, describing a sunset on a planet called Earth that had 3 colors he did not have Veilani words for. He described green fields that stretched to the horizon, beneath a sky that shifted from orange to red to purple as their sun went down. He described the sound of wind moving through tall grass, and the way small flying creatures with feathered wings would rise from the fields in great clouds at dusk. He described the smell of rain on dry earth, which humans called petrichor, and which he said was his favorite scent in the universe. He was giving them Earth. He was giving 2 terrified Veilani trapped in a collapsing corridor, a world they had never seen, painting it with words, while the radiation climbed, and his suit's integrity failed, and the metal groaned around them. Paulus later told me that she closed her eyes while Owen talked and could almost see the fields, almost feel the wind, almost smell the rain. She said his voice was the only thing that kept her from giving in to the panic that was clawing at the edges of her mind. He kept talking while his colleagues cut him free. He kept talking while the radiation saturated the corridor, and his own suit's warning systems told him in flat, mechanical tones that his exposure was exceeding safe limits. He kept talking because 2 frightened Veilani were trapped in the dark next to him, and if he stopped talking, they would have nothing to hold on to but their fear. They got them out, all 3. Varath and Paulus were shaken and bruised but mobile. Owen was worse. The beam had come down across his shoulders and upper back, and the radiation exposure had concentrated on his unshielded arms, where the suit's integrity had been compromised by the impact. His skin from the elbows down was already changing color, the first visible signs of radiation damage. Lucy pulled him through the corridor herself, one arm under his shoulders, carrying him with a strength that seemed impossible for her size. On the other side, Daniel Holt was waiting with treatment for both the crush injuries and the radiation burns. 2 survivors left, me and 1 other. Lucy came back for us while Owen was being treated, and she walked us through the corridor and the breach and into the Santiago Ridge as casually as if she were leading us from one room to another in a building that was not actively disintegrating. The moment I stepped onto the human ship, the air changed. It was thick and warm and rich with oxygen, almost too rich after 4 days of breathing recycled scraps. I stumbled, lightheaded, and a human hand caught my elbow and steadied me. I did not see whose hand it was. I did not care. Behind us, Lucy's team disconnected the pressure corridor and retracted the docking clamps. Through a viewport in the human ship's corridor, I watched the Ilsar's Promise continue its slow collapse, the midsection folding inward, the forward and aft sections pulling apart like something being torn in half. 2 minutes after the last docking clamp released, the survey vessel that had been my home for 3 months broke apart into 3 pieces and began its long, silent tumble into the void. I found Owen Price in the Santiago Ridge's medical bay, lying on a bed that was too big for a Veilani, but apparently standard for humans. His arms were wrapped in medicated dressings, and a device beside his bed was pumping cellular repair compounds into his bloodstream. Daniel said the radiation damage was significant, but treatable. Full recovery would take months. There might be scarring. I stood beside his bed and tried to find words in trade common that could carry the weight of what I felt. This person, this stranger from a species I had never encountered, had been trapped in wreckage in a corridor filling with radiation, and his response had been to tell stories to 2 frightened people he had never met before, to keep them from being afraid. I tried to thank him. I tried to explain what he had done, what it meant, the magnitude of risk he had taken for people who were not his crew, not his species, not his responsibility in any way that any logical framework could justify. He looked at me with an expression of genuine confusion, as if I were thanking him for something ordinary, something expected. "This is the job," he said. "This is what we do." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to tell him that what he had done was extraordinary, that no Vaylani crew would have accepted that level of personal risk for strangers, that our escorts had been unwilling to accept any risk at all. But he was already closing his eyes, exhaustion pulling him toward sleep, and Daniel gently suggested I let him rest. I left the medical bay and walked through the corridors of the Santiago Ridge, and I saw a ship that was nothing like the warships and trade vessels and diplomatic cruisers I had spent my career aboard. It was lived in. Photographs were attached to walls and door frames and console edges, images of humans in various settings, on green planets, beside blue oceans, holding small humans that I assumed were their young. Personal items were everywhere, a book wedged into a shelf bracket, a small plant growing in a cup mounted to a bulkhead, a piece of cloth with symbols on it pinned above a doorway. In the galley, someone had painted a mural on the back wall. It depicted a coastline, waves crashing against rocks beneath a sky filled with clouds, and above the clouds, a field of stars that blended seamlessly from the blue of an atmosphere into the black of space. It was not the work of a professional artist. The proportions were slightly off, the colors a little too vivid. But it was beautiful in the way that only something made with love can be beautiful, a piece of home carried into the void by people who chose to live far away from everything they cherished. I found a mess hall, where off-duty crew members sat together eating and talking in low voices. They looked up when I entered, and several of them offered me that teeth-baring greeting. One of them gestured to an empty seat and asked if I was hungry. I was not, but I sat anyway, because the warmth in that room was something I needed more than food. These people did not just work on this ship, they lived on it. For years at a time, out here in the Goran expanse, in the empty dark between the galaxy's arms where nothing existed and no one traveled. I found a seat in what appeared to be a common area, a room with large viewports and cushioned furniture arranged around low tables. Someone had placed a thermal blanket around my shoulders at some point. It smelled like the humans, a warm scent that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. I sat there and stared at nothing and tried to understand what had happened. We had been abandoned. Abandoned by our escorts, abandoned by our government, written off as dead and filed away in a bureaucratic system that would send polite condolence letters to our families and never think about us again. We had drifted in the dark for 4 days, breathing our last air, waiting for a death that we had accepted as inevitable. And then these humans had come. Not because we asked, not because anyone sent them, not because there was any reward or political advantage or strategic benefit. They had come because they heard a signal, a tiny heartbeat of a pulse sent out by a young engineer with a broken arm who refused to stop trying. They heard it, and they came, and they risked their lives and their ship and their health to pull 15 strangers out of a grave that should have been sealed. I sat in the common room of the Santiago Ridge, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like another species, alive in a way I had not expected to be alive again, and I did not understand. I did not have a framework for it. Nothing in my training, my culture, my species' long history of careful and calculated decisions had prepared me for the simple, staggering reality of what these humans were. Someone brought me a warm drink. It was dark and bitter, and unlike anything I had tasted before. The human who offered it said it was called coffee, and apologized that they did not have anything more suited to Vaylani preferences. I drank it, and tasted kindness in every bitter drop. The Santiago Ridge turned toward civilization at what the humans called best sustainable speed, which meant they were burning fuel at a rate that would leave them running on reserves by the time they reached the nearest Concord station. 6 days of travel through the Goran expanse, 6 days of empty space, with nothing on the sensors but the slow wheel of distant stars. I spent those 6 days learning what humans are. The ship had a crew of 22. I met each of them during that crossing, not in a formal introduction, but in the natural way that happens when you share a confined space with people who have saved your life. They drifted in and out of the common area, the medical bay, the corridors. They checked on the Vaylani survivors. They adjusted environmental controls to bring the temperature and humidity closer to our comfort range. They synthesized food compounds that approximated Vaylani nutrition, not perfectly, but close enough. Their captain was a woman named Elaine Marsh, a lean and quiet human with gray streaks in her dark hair, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they looked at without judgment. She visited me on the second day to formally introduce herself and to ask if there was anything her crew could do to make our survivors more comfortable. She showed me the ship, not all of it, but enough to understand what kind of vessel the Santiago Ridge was. She took me to the operations center, where banks of communication equipment monitored every frequency band simultaneously, automated systems flagging anything that deviated from background noise. She showed me the sensor room, where the expanse was mapped on three-dimensional displays that tracked every object larger than a shuttle within a radius I could not comprehend. And she showed me the wall. It was in the main corridor leading from the crew quarters to the operations center, a stretch of bulkhead that every crew member would pass multiple times a day. Mounted on it, in neat rows, were metal plaques. Each one bore a date, a ship name, a species, and a number. The date of the rescue, the name of the rescued vessel, the species of the survivors, the number pulled from the wreck. There were dozens of them. Some were old, their lettering worn by years of crew members brushing past them in narrow corridors. Some were new, their metal still bright. The most recent one read the name of a Scythian passenger transport, rescued 9 months ago. Below the plaques, in a separate section, was a shorter row of different markers. These bore only names and dates. Human names, crew members of the Santiago Ridge, and its predecessors, who had died during rescue operations. There were seven humans who had given their lives pulling strangers from the dark. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. I asked her the question that had been burning in me since the rescue. I asked her why the Santiago Ridge was out here. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she sat down across from me and told me. The Santiago Ridge was a dedicated search and rescue vessel operated by the Terran Union's Deep Range Recovery Service. It was one of 12 ships assigned to patrol the Goran Expanse, running continuous circuits through the dead zone, listening on all frequencies for distress signals. The crew served 3-year rotations. Some volunteered for second and third tours. The ship had been in service for 14 years. 14 years of flying through empty space, looking for people who might not be there. I asked how often they found someone. Captain Marsh said it varied. Some years they responded to a dozen calls. Some years they found no one. The current crew had been on station for 18 months and had performed 4 rescues before ours, pulling survivors from a Kalari freighter, a Toreshi science vessel, a Scythian passenger transport, and an unregistered mining ship whose crew refused to identify their species or their origin. Every rescue was different, she said. Different species, different situations, different challenges. The only constant was that someone was in trouble and needed help. I asked her who paid for this. 12 ships, crewed and supplied and maintained, running continuous patrols through a region of space with no human colonies, no human resources, no human strategic interest. Someone had to fund it. She told me the Deep Range Recovery Service was funded by a combination of government allocation and private donation. The Terran Union set aside a portion of its exploration budget specifically for search and rescue operations in unclaimed space. Private citizens contributed the rest. Some of them were survivors of past rescues. Some were families of people who had been lost in deep space and never found. Some were simply humans who believed that no one should die alone in the dark if there was any possibility of reaching them in time. I sat with that for a while. I sat with the idea of a species that taxed itself to save strangers, that built ships not for conquest or trade, but for the sole purpose of answering calls that might never come from people they had never met. On the third day, Daniel Holt invited me to help him with the medical care of my fellow Veilani, not because he needed help, but because he understood that I was a medical professional, adrift without purpose, and giving me something useful to do was itself a form of treatment. We worked side by side in the Santiago Ridge's medical bay, monitoring vitals, adjusting treatments, and talking. Daniel had been a field medic for 9 years. He had served on 3 different rescue vessels across 2 dead zones. I asked him why he kept coming back. He was quiet for a moment, checking a dosage on one of the radiation treatment protocols, And then he said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said that when he was young, his older sister had been on a colony transport that suffered an engine failure in deep space. The ship drifted for 11 days before a passing freighter picked up their distress signal and relayed it to the nearest station. By the time help arrived, 43 passengers had died from a cascade of system failures that a timely rescue could have prevented. His sister survived, most of the children on board did not. He said he decided then that he would spend his life making sure that when someone was lost in the dark, the response time would be measured in hours instead of days. He could not save his sister's shipmates. That was a wound that would never fully close. But he could make sure that somewhere out in the void, there was always a ship listening, always a crew ready to burn hard toward a signal, always a medic with a field kit and a database of 200 species who could synthesize a plasma substitute on the floor of a ruined ship in under 20 minutes. He told me this, without drama or self-importance. He stated it the way someone might state their reason for choosing one career over another, as if dedicating his life to rescuing aliens in deep space was a perfectly normal and unremarkable decision. On the fourth day, I accessed the Concord information networks through the Santiago Ridge's communications relay. The humans had powerful long-range transmitters, far more capable than standard Concord equipment, and they offered me unrestricted access to contact my government and my family. I started with the official channels. What I found there confirmed everything I had feared. The escort vessels that had fled the Dreth attack had filed their reports within 20 hours of the engagement. The Ilsar's Promise was listed as destroyed by hostile action with all hands lost. A formal investigation into the attack had been opened and immediately classified, which in Concord bureaucratic language meant it had been buried. The escort captains had been reassigned to new postings. No search mission had been authorized. No recovery effort had been proposed. We had been erased. 83 names on a casualty list, filed and forgotten, our deaths serving as a convenient cover for the cowardice of officers who chose their own survival over ours. I read the official condolence notice that had been sent to my family. It described my death in sanitized terms, thanking me for my service, expressing the Concord's deep regret, and assuring my parents that I had died with honor in the performance of my duties. I read it 3 times. Each reading made me angrier than the last. Then I searched for something else. I searched for the humans. What I found changed the way I understand the galaxy. The Terran Union operated not 12, but over 300 search and rescue vessels across known space. They patrolled every dead zone, every gap between spiral arms, every region where communications failed and trade routes did not reach. They ran continuous operations in 17 different sectors, funded by a species that had been part of the galactic community for less than 2 centuries. 300 ships, thousands of crew members, all of them out there in the silence, listening. I found records stretching back decades. Hundreds of rescues involving dozens of species: Kalari, Toreshi, Scythian, Velani, Dromorian, Pethic, Hasari, and species I had never even heard of. Ships pulled from debris fields and asteroid impacts, and pirate attacks, and engine failures, and navigational errors that had sent them spinning into the void. Survivors numbered in the thousands. The scope of it staggered me. I spent hours reading individual rescue reports, each one a story of disaster and response, of signals in the dark, and human ships burning hard to reach them. A Kalari ore hauler with a ruptured containment field, the crew of 12 rescued from a cargo bay filling with toxic gas. A Dromorian diplomatic shuttle that had strayed off course into an uncharted asteroid field, found by a human patrol vessel that had been sweeping the area on the chance that someday, someone would need help there. A Hasari generation ship, carrying 300 colonists whose navigation system had failed, discovered drifting 17 light-years from their intended course. The humans arriving with food and water and the coordinates they needed to reach their new home. Each report was filed with the same matter-of-fact precision. Distress signal detected at this time. Vessel arrived at this time. This many survivors recovered. These resources expended. Report filed by this captain on this date. No embellishment, no self-congratulation. Just data, clean and honest. The bureaucratic record of a species that treated saving lives with the same routine professionalism that other species reserved for commerce. and almost none of it was publicly acknowledged. I found rescue reports filed by human crews that were meticulous and detailed, and utterly absent from Concord records. Species that had been saved by human ships and never filed a public acknowledgement. Governments that had accepted the return of their citizens and never issued a formal statement of gratitude. It was as if the rescues had happened in a shadow, real and documented, but invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking. The humans did not seem to care. Their reports did not contain complaints about the lack of recognition. They did not track which species thanked them and which did not. They simply filed their records, refueled their ships, and went back out into the dark. On the 5th day, Owen Price was well enough to sit up in the medical bay and receive visitors. His arms were still wrapped in medicated dressings, and the cellular repair treatments had left him exhausted and pale, but his eyes were alert, and his voice was steady. When I entered, he greeted me with that teeth-baring smile and asked how I was doing, as if he were not the one lying in a hospital bed with radiation burns. I sat with him for an hour. I told him about the Concord report declaring us dead. He nodded slowly and said he was not surprised. He had seen it before. Species that abandoned their own and then covered the evidence. It was one of the reasons the Deep Range Recovery Service existed, because the humans had learned early in their galactic involvement that they could not rely on other species to rescue their own, much less anyone else. I asked him if it made him angry. He thought about it for a while. Then he said no, not angry, sad sometimes, frustrated, often, but not angry, because anger requires an expectation that things should be better, and he had stopped expecting other species to behave like humans. He said it without arrogance, without superiority, just a quiet statement of fact that landed in my chest like a stone. On the 6th day, the Santiago Ridge entered communication range of Concord Station 18, a mid-tier outpost on the edge of the Goran Expanse. Captain Marsh hailed the station and informed them that she was carrying 15 Velani survivors from the Ilsar's Promise, a vessel currently listed as destroyed with all hands. The station's response was silence, then confusion, then a flood of bureaucratic inquiries that Captain Marsh handled with the patient firmness of someone who had navigated alien red tape many times before. She provided sensor logs from the rescue, medical records for all survivors, sworn testimony from her crew, and a formal request for docking clearance to transfer the survivors to Concord custody. The station granted clearance after 4 hours of deliberation. I suspect the delay was less about verification and more about panic, because somewhere in the Concord chain of command, officials were realizing that the story they had told about the Ilsar's Promise was about to fall apart. When the Santiago Ridge docked at Station 18, a delegation of Concord officials was waiting at the airlock. They were polite, they were efficient, they were clearly terrified. They processed the survivors, took statements, and began the delicate work of dismantling their own cover-up without admitting it was a cover-up. Captain Marsh filed a standard rescue report, concise, factual, and unadorned. She listed the resources expended, the crew hours invested, the medical supplies used. She noted Owen Price's injuries and his expected recovery timeline. She requested no compensation, no formal acknowledgement, no political consideration of any kind. Then she refueled the Santiago Ridge, resupplied the medical bay, and prepared to depart. I found her in the docking corridor as her crew was running final checks. I had spent the previous hour trying to compose a formal statement of gratitude from the survivors of the Ilsar's Promise, something worthy of what her crew had done, and I had failed. Every arrangement of words I tried felt thin and inadequate against the weight of what these humans had given us. I told her I did not know how to thank her. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something that I did not expect. She put her hand on my shoulder. It was warm and heavy and solid, and the gesture carried something that words could not. "You do not need to thank us," she said. "You were in trouble. We were close enough to help. That is the beginning and the end of it." I asked her where she was going. She said back to the Gap. There were still 3 years left in her cruise rotation, and the expanse was large and full of silence, and somewhere out there, someone might be sending a pulse and hoping that someone would hear it. I stood in the station's observation gallery and watched the Santiago Ridge undock. I watched it pull away from the station and turn toward the darkness of the Goran expanse. I watched its drive signature brighten as it accelerated, a single point of light heading back into the void where nothing existed, and no one traveled, and no one should have been listening. But they were listening. They were always listening. I stood there for a long time after the light had faded, and then I went to the station's communications center and sat down at a terminal. I began composing my report to the Velani Concord, a formal account of the attack, the abandonment, the rescue, and the cover-up. I wrote 3 pages of precise bureaucratic language, carefully worded to navigate the political sensitivities of accusing our own military of cowardice and our own government of negligence. Then I stopped. I deleted the entire document, and I started again. This time, I did not write a report. I wrote a broadcast. Unsealed, unclassified, unencrypted. I transmitted it on every open channel the station's communications array could reach, and I addressed it to no one and everyone. I told them what happened, all of it, the attack and the abandonment, the 4 days of drifting in dead space, breathing thin air, watching friends die, the signal that came out of nowhere, the brutal and beautiful ship that followed it, and the humans who cut through our hull and carried our wounded, and stayed in a corridor filling with radiation, because 2 frightened Velani needed someone to talk to them in the dark. I told the galaxy about the 300 ships, the thousands of crew members who volunteered to spend years in the emptiness between stars, listening for signals that might never come. I told them about a species that funded this effort from their own treasury, not for profit or alliance or leverage, but because they believed that no one should die alone if there was any chance of reaching them. I told them about Owen Price, who lay under a fallen beam with radiation cooking his arms, and spent those minutes telling stories to strangers, because their fear mattered more to him than his own pain. I told them about Daniel Holt, who became a rescue medic because his sister survived a tragedy that killed children, and who decided that the correct response to that grief was to make sure it never happened to anyone else. I told them about Lucy Farrow, who stepped through a breach in our hull and said 4 words that contained the entire moral philosophy of her species: who is hurt worst. I told them about Captain Elaine Marsh, who refused my thanks with genuine confusion because she did not understand why saving 15 lives required gratitude. Because for her, and for every human on that ship, it was not extraordinary. It was the job. It was what they did. It was so deeply embedded in their understanding of what it means to exist alongside other living beings that they could not imagine choosing differently. And then, I ended my broadcast with a question. I said, when our escorts fled, they made a calculation. They weighed our lives against their ships and their careers, and they determined that we were not worth the risk. It was logical. It was efficient. It was the kind of cold arithmetic that governs most of the decisions made by most of the species in this galaxy. The humans did not calculate. They heard a signal, and they came. They did not ask who we were, or what we could offer them, or whether saving us would benefit their species politically. They did not weigh our value against their cost. They simply came, and they bled for us. And when it was over, they asked for nothing, and went back into the dark to wait for the next signal. What does that tell you about them? And what does it tell you about us? I closed the channel and sat in the silence of the communications center and felt the weight of those questions settle over me like a blanket. I did not have answers. I was not sure answers existed, at least not the kind that could be spoken in words. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere out in the Goran expanse, a ship crewed by 22 humans was flying back into the silence. They were running their sensors wide open, listening on every frequency, watching for the faintest flicker of a signal in the endless dark. And if that signal came, if somewhere out in the void another ship was drifting, and another crew was counting their last hours of air, and another voice was whispering into the emptiness, please, the humans would hear it. They would always hear it. Because that is what they do. That is what they have always done. Not because it is logical or profitable or strategically sound, but because somewhere in the strange and stubborn core of what makes them human, they decided that the silence between the stars is not an excuse to stop listening. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the observation gallery and watched the point where the Santiago Ridge's light had been, now nothing but darkness and distance, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt grateful to be alive in a galaxy that had humans in it. And I hoped, with everything I had, that the galaxy was paying attention.